All right, well, thank you, and I want to welcome all of you in the audience today. Take the time out of your schedule to be coming and attending, and hopefully an opportunity to share your insight, advice, and counsel as we go forward and continue to work very closely with state of Utah officials, county officials, and with members of the public as we manage your public assets and your public lands. You know, I don't normally make an entrance like I did a while ago, coming in, tripping and falling on my face and getting it caught on camera. And so the cameraman, if you'll send me a little clip of that in Washington, D.C., I'm sure there's a lot of people that would like to see that. So you see how quickly I can step up and get up and move forward. But, you know, in all honesty, it's really a pleasure to be back in Utah. Since becoming director back in August of 2009. Seems like 10 years ago, but I guess it's only a year and a half. I have been in Utah now. This is my 5th trip. And it's because of the importance of this state and the importance of the public lands that we manage in this state to this nation, to the region, to local governments, and to the people that we serve across this nation. I can't think of a better forum to appear at than the Governor's Council on Balanced Resources, because that's what it's about. That's what managing public lands for multiple purposes, multiple uses is all about. It's trying to find that balance as perfectly as we can, and you know, no doubt there's no such thing as perfect or perfection, but that shouldn't stop us from the desire to try to achieve perfection. And the way that we try to accommodate the various uses and proposals before us is through our very public land use planning process. Let me give you a little history. Many of you already know much of this, but I think to set the stage for the discussions today and set the stage for the purpose behind the Secretarial Order and the direction that we as the Bureau of Land Management are going forward in managing your public lands, I think it would be beneficial for me to just briefly state what is true and then answer the questions later on for you. First and foremost, inventorying public lands and identifying lands with wilderness characteristics, and then using the land use planning process to determine how best to manage those lands that we deem possessing wilderness characteristics is nothing new. From 1976 through 2003, the Bureau of Land Management routinely conducted inventories of public lands for a variety of reasons, including identifying lands with wilderness characteristics. We used that information and incorporated that information into our planning process. We helped, that information helped shape and formulate alternatives that were considered as part of the land use plans. The analysis that took place in addressing all those alternatives resulted in decisions through a very public process. They came out in draft decisions that were subject to protest, or first and foremost public comment. And then as we went forward and incorporating the public comment into preparing proposed final decisions, then those proposed final decisions were subject to protest. At the conclusion of resolving those protests to the best of our abilities, then we would issue a final record decision, which resulted in decisions on how public lands would be managed for the life of that land use plan. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon what side of the equation you're on, just because you have a final land use plan and a record decision doesn't necessarily take away the public's right to appeal or litigate those decisions. And so across the board, in many cases, we have been dealing with litigation as a result of land use plan decisions. Utah is no exception. Now, as we came into this administration and started looking across the board regarding your public lands and your public assets, it was very important for someone like me who has 33 years in public service, 27 and a half of those years with the Bureau of Land Management, of making sure that we do open up these public lands, that we do manage these public lands for multiple uses. And by that, I mean the full range of multiple uses. Not only entertaining lands for commodity production, but we're providing appropriate actions to conserve these resources so that the lifestyle that we enjoy today can be a lifestyle that future generations can also enjoy. That's part of our multiple use mission, to make sure that we not only accommodate the needs of today's society, but we also manage these public assets in such a way that the future has the same chance as we do to have a quality of life that we enjoy. So as we go forward and look at public land management, it's not just about today. It's not just about producing every commodity that might exist today for the enjoyment and use of today's generation. It's about sustainability. It's about valuing these lands for a variety of resources, including conservation. Addressing the need to provide suitable lands for opportunities for solitude, to enjoy the natural setting, to get away from the day-to-day congestion that we are challenged with in our society. So that is one of the components, that's one of the factors that we do take into account as we go through the land use plans. This past year, we have done a lot of discussion in the Department of Interior relative to how to make sure that we bring some balance to multiple use, not ignoring the opportunities and the obligations that we have to provide needed resources, including energy resources, to this nation. We are moving forward with providing appropriate public lands for energy development, renewable and non-renewable. We're moving forward to provide the transmission lines that are necessary to move that energy source to the market. We're moving forward to continue to provide lands, public lands, as appropriate for grazing. We're moving forward to make sure that sage-grouse habitat and other habitat for sensitive and sensitive species are addressed, so that we can reduce the need to continue to list more and more species as endangered. Because as more and more species are listed, then it does take away our options. It does take away our flexibility on how these public lands are to be managed now and into the future. So to the degree possible, we need to be smart about how these lands are managed. We need to bring people together earlier rather than later into the process so that they play an important role in helping us shape these decisions that come about through a very public process. Let there be no doubt in anyone's mind, as a 33-year public servant, 27 and a half years in the Bureau of Land Management, that I believe in multiple use management. I believe in the need to make energy available to the public. I also believe that we have an obligation and responsibility to provide conservation of sensitive resources, including those wilderness resources. As a result of that, we review the actions that have taken place, the administrative actions that have taken place in previous administrations. The fact that wilderness inventories and that information being used relative to shape how public lands would be managed, including lands with wilderness characteristics, were conducted under Presidents Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and President Bill Clinton, led us to believe that we needed to go back to the way that we had previously managed these lands and to incorporate into our full multiple use spectrum lands with wilderness characteristics, and through a very public process, make a determination of how we intend to manage such resources into the future. As a result of that decision, within the Department of Interior, Secretary Ken Salazar moved forward with a secretarial order that he issued in December 2010. That secretarial order directs the Bureau of Land Management to recognize the importance of lands with wilderness characteristics. It also directs the Bureau of Land Management to conduct routine inventories of our public lands and to identify those lands with wilderness characteristics, and through a public process, determine how or if we're going to manage those lands to protect those wilderness characteristics for years to come. And those decisions will be reached through a land use planning decision or land use planning process. Again, the actions that we're taking are not new. They're actions that have been practiced in previous administrations. We're committed to reaching out to all public, to engage all public in how these public lands are to be managed. We have tried to fulfill that obligation. We have tried to fulfill that commitment. Juan Palmer, our state director here for the Bureau of Land Management in Utah, will share with you some of the plans that we do have to continue this dialogue that we will have with you and many, many other stakeholders on how we're going to manage these public lands, not just in Utah, but across the western United States. These are important assets. We understand that. As we go forward, our intentions are to do things that under the authorities that are vested in the Federal Land Policy Management Act under sections 201 and 202 specifically, that just like we conduct inventories to identify archaeological resources, sensitive habitats, cultural resources, other types of sensitive resources or other types of resources through a very a scientific inventory. We will conduct inventories to identify lands with wilderness characteristics. In fact, in this state, we have done that several times. We have a good feel for what lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management do possess wilderness characteristics. So it's not going to require an awful lot of work for us to go back and hit the ground and start re-inventorying these lands that we've already inventoried. We will use the inventories that have been completed. If we have new information, we'll go back to the lands and revisit some of the earlier inventories to update those inventories, and then our plans are to use that information as part of our land use plan. So again, as we go forward, I hope that today's conversation will provide you some assurance, some information of what the intent is, how we intend to implement the secretarial order, how we intend to do our jobs in managing your public assets, so that at the end of the day, that the full range of multiple uses are recognized in our decisions and through our actions. So Juan, if you'd like to add anything to what I said.
Thank you. My name is Juan Palma, the State Director of the in Utah. Yeah, we are not going to be able to answer every question you may have here today as we begin our dialogue on this policy that's Bob discussed. But what I intend to do is to go out and visit with many of you in the days and weeks to come and answer many of the questions that you may have. Let me just say that there is an awful lot of projects that we have here in Utah that are really important to the state for the economic level. I am a big proponent that it really is not the environment against the economy or the economy against the environment, that we can solve the issues to have a balance of both the economy and the environment. And I believe we'll find those answers that we need here in Utah to be able to make sure that we have strong economic development and yet be able to find a balance to provide protection for generations to come in our stewardship that will have to deliver to the generations to come. So with that in mind, I think that we'd rather have some of the questions that you may have and be able to answer some of them and then be able to then proceed to get some of your input. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Abbey, and thank you, Director Juan Palma. Robert Stenlove is over here. Robert, just keep those, and when we get finished with the council's questions, we'll come to those questions. I don't know if you've met Ali Isom, the governor's new deputy chief of staff. All right, that'll run that title. And Ali just joined the governor's staff. And then as we go around, if you'd each raise your hand so people know who you are. Bill Fenimore and Mike Styler, Pat Shea, John Harja. And we're honored to have our Lieutenant Governor with us, Greg Bell. And then going over to this side, Lynn Stevens, Representative Mike Noel, Amanda Smith, Julie Mack, Laura Nelson, Kathleen Clark, and Kathleen and Pat are former directors of the BLM, so they share that, they bring that expertise. And we're honored to have Jim Hansen up here with us today. He's not a member of the council, but he looks pretty good sitting over there. Mike Maurer, our other Deputy Chief of Staff, is also with us here in this corner. So that's sort of who we are. I'd like to now open it to the council for your questions. Lynn? I think that mic's...
This is on? Yeah. Well, for 7 years as a county commissioner, working virtually every week with the development of the resource management plans for San Juan County, and going through the real thorough process of evaluation alternatives, and realizing that really just about anywhere in the entire state of Utah you can find wilderness characteristics out on the land. So we understand over 2 million acres of land in the state were identified with having some wilderness character, but only 400,000 were accepted in the RMP to be protected with this natural condition consideration. It's my understanding this new directive is going to create another review of the other over 2 million acres to see if they indeed have wilderness characteristics that would justify protection. I'm just wondering if the reevaluation is going to use the same wilderness characteristic criteria that is contained in the Wilderness Act. If you're going to have a new methodology, if you're going to have new people, it would almost indicate that the competency of those who evaluated the wilderness characters in the first place is under question. So with regard to that aspect, I would just say, what's new and what do you expect to get out of another review of over 2 million acres that fell out?
Well, thank you again. That's an important question to raise, and I'd be happy to respond. In the most recent land use planning that the Bureau of Land Management has conducted in Utah, there were 6 resource management plans completed, and most of them completed and signed off in 2008, I believe. In those 6 resource management plans, there were 2.8 million acres that were identified through BLM's inventory efforts as possessing wilderness characteristics. 2.8 million acres. The criteria used to evaluate what wilderness characteristics are is the mandatory wilderness values that are included as part of the Wilderness Act of 1964. First, it relates to size. An area must be 5,000 acres or more in size of contiguous area, unless there is a sufficient reason or appropriate reason that a smaller area could be managed as wilderness to preserve the wilderness resources. And usually in the case of a smaller area being considered for designated wilderness by Congress, it would be an area that is contiguous to or near an existing wilderness area. So in some cases, an area that is considered to possess wilderness characteristics could be smaller than 5,000 acres. But in most cases, as we look to the Wilderness Act to give guidance, we're looking at size and the area of 5,000 acres or more. The second mandatory criteria in the Wilderness Act is that the area is primarily natural in character, roadless. And by that is that the characteristics are the areas reflect naturalness, the lack of man-made features in the whole component of what one deems to be natural. The third mandatory criteria, again coming from the Wilderness Act, is outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. So those were the criteria that were used in conducting earlier inventories. As we go forward and have to conduct future inventories, that would be the same criteria that would be used in future inventories. Okay, now having said that, 2.8 million acres identified with lands with wilderness characteristics that were considered as part of those 6 resource management plans. At the end of the day, the decisions came back that 400,000 of those 2.8 million acres that possess wilderness characteristics would be designated as natural areas, and therefore those wilderness characteristics in those 400,000 acres would be managed to protect those wilderness characteristics. Consistent with the Secretary order that was issued in December, we will go back and revisit those land use plans from the standpoint of doing plan conformance review. And by that I mean we would look to see what criteria that was used by the BLM offices in coming up with their decisions to protect 400,000 out of the 2.8 million acres of wilderness characteristics. And if that review determines to us that appropriate analysis was given to those 2.8 million acres, and that the decision of protecting only 400,000 acres was consistent with the intent of the most recent Secretary order, then we will support those decisions. If it is determined from our conformance review that those decisions that came out of whatever methodology used by the local office is inconsistent with the Secretary order, then it may require us to go back and revisit those land use plans and amend some of those decisions. But we won't know that until the conformance review is completed.
Thank you. I think I see Mike Cyrus here. Mike?
Thank you. Welcome, Director. Glad to see you again. As you're aware, because we've discussed this with you before, we have a partnership here in Utah called the Utah Partners for Conservation and Development. And it consists of Utah land managers and federal land managers. We have BLM, Forest Service, NRCS, Department of Natural Resources, but we have private partners. We have Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation, Nature Conservancy. The counties are involved, and we all work together towards land health. And we work on a project called the Utah Watershed Initiative, and we take turns being chairs. And it so happened this year, Juan Palma was elected the chair of this group. And we're quite proud of the work of the partnership and restoring land health. We've worked actively in aspen restoration and in removing encroaching pinyon juniper stands, and we work to remove invasive species, cheatgrass and other plants that are invasive species. And today we have actually reseeded about 700,000 acres here in the state. That doesn't count any of the fire reseedings or any other work that we've done, but we've worked on over 1 million acres in the state. Some of this active management, where we mechanically get on the ground to reseed, we fear may now become some of these wilderness areas. We wonder. I just wonder, can you give us an idea? Would that be an interference with the restoration work that we're doing for land health?